They mocked him. They said no real sniper would ever strap a soup can to the front of his rifle. But on a muddy jungle ridge in World War II, that ridiculous trick became the one thing that stopped an entire Japanese assault and helped a lone U.S. sniper take down 98 enemy soldiers. Today, you're about to hear the insane battlefield story they never taught you in any history class. A story where improvisation beats doctrine, and a simple soup can becomes the deadliest tool on the ridge. Before we dive in, make sure you subscribe so you never miss these unbelievable military tactics and forgotten war stories. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and what are you doing right now as you watch this video? I read every comment, and it's always amazing to see where our viewers are tuning in from. Alright, let's jump straight into the moment when a joke became a battlefield legend. The 12th of March, 1944, Luzon, Philippine jungle. The rain from the night before still clung to the leaves, hanging in trembling droplets that caught the weak morning light. A U.S. sniper lay flat in the mud at the edge of a ridge, his helmet buried under wet foliage, his cheek pressed against the stock of his rifle. Every breath he took tasted like soil and humidity. Every sound seemed too close. His rifle, an M1903 he had carried for 9 months, looked normal from a distance. But anyone who crawled close enough to see the front of the barrel would have spotted the thing that made his squad laugh for 2 days straight. A soup can, cut open and strapped in place with a strip of parachute cord. "Looks like a mess hall joke," one of the men had said. Another added, "You gonna feed the Japanese or shoot them?" But out here, on this ridge overlooking a narrow jungle trail, the sniper wasn't laughing. The glare from the broken canopy above made his scope nearly useless. Sunlight stabbed into the lenses, the kind of shifting brightness that made targets vanish for half a heartbeat long enough for a man to die. The official sniper manual never mentioned a fix for jungle glare. It only said, "Keep the barrel clear, keep the optics clean," but nothing about what to do when the forest itself turned your optics against you. So he had made this stupid, ridiculous, improvised light tunnel by cutting a ration can in half and aligning it with the path of his scope. In the mud, under fire, he found that the narrow cylinder blocked the worst of the glare and sharpened the contrast of anything moving in the distance. It wasn't regulation, it wasn't even sane, but it worked. Below the ridge, something shifted. Brush snapped, branches rustled. Japanese infantry, an entire column, were filtering through the undergrowth, moving fast, moving quiet. The squad behind him froze. Someone whispered into the radio, but the line crackled uselessly. The sniper didn't move, didn't speak, didn't breathe. He let the soup can settle into place, its rim forming a dark tunnel around the sight picture. The world outside narrowed into one small circle of clarity. Shadows became shapes, shapes became men. The first target appeared just a hint of movement, the tilt of a helmet above a rising slope. He steadied his breath, squeezed, and the rifle kicked against his shoulder. The man below dropped instantly. No one in the squad said a word. The sniper adjusted his cheek weld, chambered the next round, and pressed back into the mud. Dozens more shadows were coming through the trees. The stupid soup can shuddered with each heartbeat, but the sight picture stayed razor sharp. They had mocked it. They wouldn't mock it for long. The ridge stretched along the jungle hillside like a narrow spine of earth, offering barely enough elevation for observation, while still forcing the sniper to press his body flat against the cold mud as the morning haze drifted slowly across the tree line. The air carried a thick mixture of damp soil and rotting leaves, creating a heavy scent that clung to every breath he took and settled deep in his lungs. Far below, the jungle trail curved through ferns and tangled roots, forming a natural funnel that guided the approaching Japanese soldiers directly into his field of fire, without them realizing how exposed they were becoming with each cautious step forward. Behind him, the squad crouched in shallow depressions carved hurriedly into the ridge, their uniforms darkened by moisture, and their faces streaked with grime, as they strained to hear movements beneath the layered chorus of insects echoing through the forest. Every man understood that visibility in this terrain shifted unpredictably, with shafts of sunlight breaking through the canopy in scattered bursts that blinded the eye one moment and revealed entire silhouettes the next, turning even the simplest shot into a gamble against the jungle's chaotic lighting. The sniper's improvised soup can tunnel reduced the harsh reflections enough to restore a sense of control, granting him a clarity that no regulation field manual had ever prepared him to expect in conditions this hostile. He adjusted his position slowly, sliding his elbows into the mud to stabilize the rifle, while letting the damp earth absorb the recoil that would follow each deliberate shot. The forest around them felt deceptively calm, yet the subtle shifts of brush below indicated disciplined movement from soldiers trained to exploit concealment, advancing with a confidence born from previous successes in similar ambush terrain. Each faint rustle suggested another squad pushing forward, and the sniper recognized the growing pattern of coordinated flanking attempts designed to collapse the ridgeline and force his squad into a desperate retreat. A faint metallic click from somewhere behind a fallen log confirmed the presence of a Japanese NCO, signaling his men, and the sniper lowered his cheek to the stock, allowing the soup can tunnel to frame the scene in a narrow, steady circle, untouched by shifting glare. Through this handmade tube, the entire chaotic jungle condensed into one stable viewpoint that sharpened distant motion with almost unnatural precision, revealing helmets, rifles, and crouched forms weaving through the brush with increasing speed. He exhaled slowly, letting the breath escape in a controlled stream that steadied both his heart rate and the crosshairs drifting across the narrow gap where the first enemy would soon appear. The ridge felt smaller with every passing second, shrinking into a fragile barricade between survival and collapse. Yet the sniper sensed an unusual calm settling over him as the improvised device turned uncertainty into opportunity. Below, the lead Japanese soldier finally stepped into the clearing formed by the trail's bend, unaware that his cautious advance had placed him directly inside the sniper's tightened field of view. The man paused, scanned the ridge, and raised his hand to signal the rest of the column, but the sniper had already committed to the shot, feeling the rifle stabilize beneath him as the soup can eliminated the last trace of glare from the sight picture. The moment stretched, suspended in silence, as the jungle held its breath around him, and the squad behind him waited for the sound that would announce the beginning of the fight none of them could avoid. The moment the first enemy soldier dropped, the ridge seemed to awaken with a sudden, violent urgency, as the squad realized the Japanese column was much larger than expected, and advancing with a determination that suggested a coordinated assault rather than a probing maneuver. The radio crackled uselessly in the background, spilling fragments of static and broken syllables that never formed coherent instructions, leaving the men relying purely on instinct and whatever signals they could shout over the rising noise of movement below. Several riflemen shifted nervously in their shallow firing positions, wiping mud from their hands while trying to steady their weapons as the jungle canopy reverberated with the unmistakable rhythm of approaching boots, crushing wet leaves in synchronized strides. The sergeant attempted to issue whispered commands, but his voice wavered under the strain, carrying a hint of disbelief at how quickly the situation had deteriorated as more figures began to appear between the trees, their silhouettes forming a dark chain that climbed steadily toward the ridge. One machine gunner struggled to load a new belt, while his assistant fumbled with the ammo box, their fingers slipping repeatedly on the damp metal as they realized the trail offered almost no natural cover for a prolonged defense. Another rifleman cursed under his breath when a misfeed jammed his bolt, forcing him to pull back abruptly and reveal his position to any enemy scanning the tree line above. The sniper remained pressed into the mud, yet he could feel the chaos ripple outward from every member of the squad as each man confronted the terrifying reality that the ridge might be overrun within minutes if the Japanese succeeded in massing their forces at the trail's bend. He sensed the rising panic through the subtle tremors in the ground each time someone shifted too quickly or kicked loose a stone that tumbled quietly down the slope, signaling their location to the attackers who were steadily tightening the noose. Sweat trickled down the sides of his face, mixing with mud and stinging his eyes, but he kept his cheek firmly against the stock, knowing that any lapse in concentration would cost the squad precious seconds they did not possess. The enemy's approach grew bolder as the forest erupted with sharp commands in clipped Japanese tones, followed by the clatter of rifles being readied for an uphill assault that would rely on overwhelming numbers rather than stealth. A fragmentation grenade landed somewhere to the right of the ridge, sending a muted thump through the ground that caused two riflemen to flatten themselves instinctively, while struggling to determine whether it had detonated prematurely or was simply thrown short. The machine gunner finally managed to mount his weapon, but the angle of the slope left him with a dangerously narrow arc of fire, forcing him to depend entirely on the sniper to thin the attackers before they closed within lethal range. Despite the frantic energy around him, the sniper's world remained confined to the narrow circular frame created by the soup can lashed to his barrel, which transformed the disorder of the jungle into a focused tunnel of clarity. where each enemy movement became a distinct, trackable target. He sensed his comrades relying on him more heavily with every passing moment, understanding that their survival depended on his ability to strike first and disrupt the Japanese formation before it reached the midpoint of the ascent. The squad's breathing grew louder behind him, timed with the frantic racing of their thoughts, yet he tuned out every distraction and let the tunnel guide his sight toward the next shadow that emerged from the undergrowth. As another soldier stepped into view, raising his rifle and signaling the rest forward, the sniper steadied his breath and centered the reticle with a calmness that defied the mounting chaos surrounding him, preparing to fire the shot that would either slow the assault or condemn the ridge to collapse beneath the weight of overwhelming force. Back at Fort Benning, the sniper had spent long months memorizing the strict sequences laid out in the U.S. Army Sniper Field Manual, which insisted that mastery came from absolute consistency in positioning, breathing, trigger discipline, and barrel management under conditions far more predictable than anything the Pacific jungle had ever offered. The instructors hammered the same lessons relentlessly, reminding recruits that the barrel must remain unobstructed at all times because even minor interference could alter harmonics, disrupt muzzle stability, or introduce unpredictable deviations that might transform a clean shot into a fatal miss. Every demonstration insisted the rifle should be aligned along a perfectly natural sightline, with the optic receiving unobstructed light, allowing the marksman to track subtle movements across open terrain with clarity unspoiled by glare or shifting shadows. During training, the range presented an orderly environment where the sun remained behind the shooters. The wind direction stayed constant, and the targets appeared as clean silhouettes rather than elusive shapes hidden behind layers of damp foliage, swaying vines, and drifting jungle haze. The manual assured them that mastering these fundamentals would allow any trained sniper to adapt quickly to unfamiliar terrain, yet it never acknowledged how utterly different the sensory landscape became. Once humidity distorted the air, insects filled every pause with noise, and sunlight fractured through uneven canopy patterns that danced unpredictably across the scope. Recruits learned to control respiration in steady cycles, to maintain a stable cheek weld, and to apply measured pressure on the trigger. But nothing in the curriculum prepared them for the brutal reality of shooting from a ridge soaked in mud, while enemy soldiers advanced with disciplined silence through terrain designed to hide their every movement. The sniper remembered those lessons vividly, hearing the instructor's voice echoing in his mind as he pressed deeper into the mud, repeating the mantra that clean optics were a lifeline, because clarity ensured survival when seconds mattered most. Yet clarity here was an illusion, continually shattered by harsh shafts of sunlight that stabbed across the scope lens and transformed the sight picture into a chaotic blur whenever the canopy shifted in the breeze. He knew the manual discouraged unnecessary improvisation, insisting that stability came from adherence to established methods, but the jungle mocked those principles with every new reflection glinting off the wet leaves and every unpredictable change in lighting that erased his targets at the worst possible instant. The standard prone position he had practiced thousands of times also felt inadequate atop this uneven ridge, where the soil shifted under his elbows and created subtle tremors that traveled into the rifle, amplifying barrel vibration during rapid follow-up shots. Even the supposed predictability of recoil became distorted by the damp earth absorbing force unevenly, making his shoulder adjustments more guesswork than science. These deviations might have seemed minor in a controlled environment, yet here, they threatened to turn precise marksmanship into desperate chance, revealing just how wide the gap was between theoretical instruction and unforgiving combat realities. He understood now that the manual's rigid framework was built for soldiers operating in clean fields, dry foothills, or controlled engagements, rather than claustrophobic jungles, where every ray of light might betray the shooter, and every tree root fought against a stable firing platform. The soup can tunnel had emerged not from defiance of training, but from necessity forged by environmental conditions the manual simply could not account for, conditions that demanded creativity over conformity. As he steadied his rifle once more and watched another shadow move along the slope, he realized that survival here depended less on reciting textbook procedures and far more on adapting instincts to a battlefield that refused to follow anyone's rules, least of all the ones written in a classroom thousands of miles away. The deeper the sniper settled into the jungle's oppressive humidity, the clearer it became that the traditional doctrines drilled into him at Fort Benning never anticipated an environment where light behaved like a living organism, bending and scattering unpredictably through layers of trembling leaves that constantly reshaped the battlefield's visual geometry. Each shift in the canopy produced a surge of glare that washed across his scope with blinding intensity, forcing him to blink away distortions that appeared and vanished too quickly for any conventional adjustment to compensate, turning even simple target tracking into a struggle against an environment actively working to obscure every threat. Beneath this unstable lighting, the air shimmered with moisture rising from the ground, creating a mirage-like distortion that warped edges and softened outlines, degrading clarity in ways no standard optic could reliably counter, and reducing the value of every traditional marksmanship technique he had practiced. Compounding the visual instability, the ridge itself worked against him by flexing unpredictably under the shifting weight of his body, as the soil softened from rainfall, creating subtle tremors that traveled through his elbows and into the rifle, with each attempt to stabilize his firing position. These micro-vibrations disrupted the barrel's natural harmonics, introducing inconsistencies that grew more pronounced with repeated shots as heat built along the steel, and altered the recoil pattern he had once believed was fixed and easily manageable. The manual insisted that controlled breathing and a firm, disciplined shoulder weld could overcome environmental instability. Yet here, every breath he released mingled with the saturated air in front of the scope, adding another layer of haze to a sight picture already strained by glare and humidity. The rifle itself suffered under the jungle's assault, with moisture seeping into seams and swelling the wooden stock just enough to interfere with predictable cheek alignment, forcing him to constantly readjust his position to maintain the angle required for accurate sighting. Even his strongest eye, normally a reliable anchor for depth judgment and target recognition, struggled to maintain consistent focus as sweat and mud threatened to impair visibility with every blink, creating an additional cognitive burden that standard training had never addressed. These seemingly minor complications accumulated into a compounding problem that eroded the reliability of established doctrine, revealing that the very idea of a universal technique collapsed when confronted by a battlefield shaped by heat, moisture, and chaotic light. Worse still, the jungle amplified auditory confusion as insects, shifting branches, and distant movement blended into a continuous drone that masked the subtle cues needed to anticipate enemy positioning, forcing the sniper to rely even more heavily on visual clarity that his scope could no longer consistently provide. The instructors had taught that patience and discipline prevented fatal mistakes, yet patience was meaningless when the environment itself removed the visual stability required to make informed decisions, turning caution into paralysis and action into guesswork. He recognized now that the manual assumed a world in which the marksman fought the enemy alone. Not the terrain, the air, the light, and the relentless pull of exhaustion that frayed the edges of judgment. In this hostile domain, the true root cause of the failure became undeniable. The standard method was never flawed because of its principles, but because it presumed conditions that simply did not exist on this ridge, where every natural element conspired to distort the rifle's behavior, the optic's performance, and the sniper's perception. The soup can tunnel, crude and laughable as it appeared, addressed problems the manual refused to acknowledge, offering a narrow but consistent channel of controlled light that cut through the jungle's visual chaos and restored a clarity no regulation tool could match. As he steadied the rifle once more and watched another shadow drift between the trees, he understood that survival demanded adaptation, not adherence, and that the battlefield rewarded ingenuity long before it honored tradition. The idea for the soup can tunnel had not arrived as a stroke of brilliance, but rather as a desperate impulse formed in the narrow space between fear and instinct, when the sniper realized that no amount of training would overcome the jungle's crippling glare without an entirely different approach to controlling the incoming light. He remembered staring at the warped reflections shimmering across his scope and feeling an unfamiliar frustration rising inside him. Knowing that each distortion risked turning a clean shot into a dangerous guess, especially with enemy soldiers advancing in numbers that left no margin for error. His mind raced through every technique he had been taught, yet none of them offered even the slightest remedy for the blinding bursts of sunlight that pierced the canopy and destroyed the sight picture whenever the trees shifted in the humid breeze. As he reached into his pack searching for a cleaning cloth, his fingers brushed the metal edge of a discarded soup can from the previous night's rations, still faintly warm from being rinsed and tucked beside his gear out of habit. The moment his hand touched the smooth cylinder, a sudden clarity struck him as he realized the can's narrow shape could potentially channel the light in a controlled path, narrowing the chaotic reflections into a stable tunnel that filtered out the glare, overwhelming his optics. He pulled it free with a mixture of curiosity and urgency, turning it over in his hands while visualizing the way the cylinder might isolate a single axis of light and create a protective shade around the scope's front lens, similar to the principle behind field-expedient blinders used by marksmen during early morning competitions. With no proper tools available, he used his bayonet to slice a shallow groove along the rim, widening it just enough to slide onto the barrel without interfering with muzzle clearance or affecting bullet trajectory. The metal resisted at first, bending awkwardly between his palms, yet it yielded enough for him to shape it into a crude but functional extension that aligned almost perfectly with the barrel's centerline. Sweat dripped from his forehead as he worked, not from exertion but from the awareness that every minute spent modifying the can was a minute stolen from preparing for an attack that could erupt at any moment along the ridge. He wrapped the base with a strip of parachute cord pulled from a damaged harness, tightening it carefully until the can clamped securely in place without rattling or shifting under its own weight. When he finally lifted the rifle to his shoulder, the effect was immediate and astonishing, as the scope's sight picture transformed from a blinding mosaic of fractured light into a sharp, controlled circle where targets appeared with clarity, untouched by the chaotic shimmer of the jungle. The improvised tunnel filtered the excess brightness with surprising efficiency, turning the scope into a focused instrument capable of cutting through glare that had previously rendered it unreliable in the shifting canopy. For the first time since reaching the ridge, he felt a renewed sense of control settle into his muscles, as though the battlefield itself had stopped fighting against him and allowed his training to function as intended. The squad's reaction, however, was far less impressed, with several soldiers exchanging amused glances as they spotted the can protruding awkwardly from the barrel and whispering jokes about their sniper turning into a field cook rather than a marksman. Their laughter echoed quietly through the foliage, light-hearted but dismissive, reinforcing the notion that his unconventional solution belonged in a mess tent rather than a combat zone. Yet despite the ridicule, he maintained his grip with quiet certainty, focusing on the transformed sight picture and recognizing that the device offered something far more valuable than approval. It provided reliability where the jungle had offered none. When he settled back into position overlooking the trail, he felt the first surge of confidence he had experienced since dawn, knowing this improvised invention born from frustration, instinct, and necessity might be the only barrier standing between his squad and the overwhelming force advancing from the tree line. The soup can tunnel, crude and absurd as it appeared, had become the one tool capable of turning the jungle's hostile light into an ally rather than an enemy. The sniper steadied his breathing as the jungle below shifted subtly, revealing the faint silhouette of a Japanese soldier advancing with slow, deliberate steps that suggested he was scouting the ridge for weaknesses rather than charging blindly into an ambush. Through the soup can tunnel, the man's shape emerged with a clarity that felt almost surreal, displaying crisp edges and defined contours that had been impossible to perceive only moments earlier when glare had overwhelmed the scope. The filtered light created a narrow cone of visibility that sliced cleanly through the chaotic reflections, allowing the sniper to track the target's movements with a precision he had not expected from such a crude, improvised device. He let his cheek settle deeper into the stock, adjusting his elbow slightly to counter the soft shift of the mud beneath him, while maintaining the delicate balance required to keep the reticle steady atop the moving figure. Each muscle in his body responded with measured discipline, working in unison to create the stable firing platform that training demanded, yet had eluded him since reaching the ridge. The tunnel framed the soldier perfectly, offering a focused vantage point that eliminated peripheral distractions and forced his attention onto the single human shape navigating the narrowing trail. Every sound around him faded slightly as his heartbeat slowed, syncing with the controlled rhythm of his breathing and aligning his senses with the rifle in a way that felt both instinctive and profoundly deliberate. Behind him, the squad fell silent, sensing the shift in his posture and recognizing that the moment they had all anticipated was finally unfolding as the sniper prepared to validate the invention they had mocked. A few soldiers exchanged uncertain glances, their earlier jokes fading into quiet apprehension as they realized the survival of the ridge might depend on the effectiveness of a repurposed can of soup rather than the equipment issued by the army. The sergeant crouched low, clutching his rifle with tense fingers, unwilling to interrupt the sniper while also unable to hide his anxiety as the enemy continued to climb toward their position with increasing confidence. The target paused near a cluster of ferns, raising his head toward the ridge as though sensing the faint shift of movement that accompanied the sniper's final adjustment. Sunlight flickered across the leaves above him, but the soup can tunnel absorbed the glare before it could distort the sight picture, preserving the clarity the sniper needed to make the shot count. He exhaled slowly, letting the air escape in a steady stream that calmed the slight tremor in his shoulder and brought the reticle precisely onto the soldier's upper chest, the preferred aiming point for maximum stability at this distance. His trigger finger tightened with deliberate pressure, moving not in a sudden jerk but in the smooth, almost invisible motion taught in training, merging instinct with discipline in a moment suspended between courage and necessity. The rifle fired with a sharp, controlled crack that echoed through the ridge, momentarily silencing the insects and startling the squad as the recoil pressed firmly into his shoulder without disrupting his alignment. Through the tunnel, he watched the impact unfold with clinical clarity as the enemy soldier collapsed instantly, his forward momentum severed by the precise shot that landed exactly where the reticle had rested a split second earlier. For a brief moment, the jungle held its breath, absorbing the shock of the sound and then releasing it as birds scattered upward and leaves trembled from the concussion rippling through the canopy. The squad stared at the sniper in stunned silence, their expressions shifting from disbelief to dawning realization as they processed the impossible accuracy achieved with a device they had ridiculed only hours before. The sergeant exhaled a shaky breath, muttering something halfway between awe and apology, while the others instinctively adjusted their positions, suddenly believing the ridge might hold after all. The sniper, however, wasted no time celebrating the result, instead chambering another round with practiced efficiency and recentering his eye within the soup can tunnel to reacquire new movement among the trees. Because one shot had proven the invention worked, but dozens more were coming, and the ridge still needed saving. The sniper barely registered the stunned quiet behind him, because the instant the first Japanese soldier fell, another figure shifted through the ferns below, offering a second fleeting silhouette that tested whether his improvised tunnel could deliver repeatable accuracy rather than a single stroke of luck. Through the soup can cylinder, the new target appeared with the same crisp edges and stable contrast as the first, as though the jungle's chaotic glare had been replaced by a controlled stage where every motion was illuminated with deliberate clarity. He recognized the emerging pattern almost immediately. The tunnel not only filtered the excess light but also forced his vision into a single unwavering axis that prevented the peripheral flicker from disrupting his focus during rapid target reacquisition. He drew a slow breath, feeling the rifle settle into a natural rhythm that merged seamlessly with the steady contraction of his heartbeat, creating a cycle of motion that matched the pace of the approaching footsteps below. The second shot landed with the same precision as the first, striking the advancing soldier before the man even realized he had been sighted, and the sniper felt a subtle rush of confirmation as the body collapsed against a tree root with a muted thud. This consistency mattered far more than the kills themselves, because reliability in combat meant survivability, and every precise shot strengthened his confidence that the makeshift device on his barrel had evolved from a strange experiment into a practical battlefield tool. The pattern deepened as more shadows emerged through the undergrowth, moving in staggered intervals that suggested a disciplined formation attempting to flank the ridge, yet each new target entered his sight picture with nearly identical clarity, unaffected by the shifting canopy or the dazzling shafts of sunlight slicing across the trail. He realized that the soup can's narrow interior created a distinct focal channel that reduced parallax errors by limiting how much his eye could drift within the scope, allowing his muscle memory to align each successive shot more quickly and with far less cognitive strain. Even the slight muzzle vibrations generated by firing were partially mitigated by the tunnel's rigid alignment, which provided a subtle stabilizing effect he had not anticipated until he noticed how quickly he could recenter after recoil. Behind him, the squad finally recognized the significance of what was happening, because each crack of the rifle was followed by the unmistakable sound of another Japanese soldier dropping to the forest floor, creating a rhythmic sequence that seemed almost mechanical in its precision. The sergeant whispered an incredulous remark about the tunnel's effectiveness, Yet his voice carried an undercurrent of relief, acknowledging that this improvised device had become the anchor holding their defensive line together. The machine gunner, struggling to find a clear lane of fire, began timing his movements to the sniper's volleys, trusting the pattern enough to shift positions only between shots. When the immediate threat momentarily decreased, the sniper continued firing with controlled discipline, allowing his breathing to dictate the pace as each target was acquired, tracked, and neutralized in a sequence so fluid it felt as though the jungle itself had slowed to match his rhythm. With every shot, the tunnel transformed the chaotic battlefield into a narrowly defined corridor where enemy movement became predictable, enabling him to read subtle cues in posture, angle, and speed that would normally vanish in the glare-filled haze. He sensed himself slipping into a state of heightened focus, where time stretched just enough to provide the space required for calculation, yet compressed again the moment the trigger broke and recoil drove through his shoulder. As the bodies accumulated along the trail and the hillside, the pattern no longer felt like coincidence, but rather an emergent synergy between environmental necessity and improvised engineering, turning each challenge posed by the jungle into an opportunity for control. And with every precise shot echoing across the ridge, the squad behind him began to understand that the invention they once mocked had become the single most reliable constant in a battlefield where nothing else obeyed the rules. The tempo of the battle shifted dramatically as the Japanese forces realized that their initial probing advance had been met with an unexpectedly precise and unbroken stream of fire, prompting them to reorganize into larger assault elements that pushed forward with a determination intensified by the urgency of overwhelming the ridge before the sniper could dismantle their momentum entirely. Through the soup can tunnel, the sniper watched these groups emerge in waves, each one larger than the last, their silhouettes converging along the narrowing trail, with the steady focus of soldiers convinced that sheer numbers would eventually smother the defenders, clinging desperately to the high ground. The jungle, once defined by isolated movements and cautious steps, now vibrated with the coordinated rhythm of boots, weapons, and shouted commands that carried upward through the foliage, like the steady roll of an approaching storm. He adjusted his firing position repeatedly as the volume of targets increased, shifting along the ridge with careful precision to prevent his vantage point from becoming predictable, while still maintaining the critical stability required for accurate long-range shots under mounting pressure. Mud clung to his elbows and forearms, threatening to compromise his control, yet the rifle responded faithfully as he aligned the reticle within the soup can tunnel and sent another round, tearing down the slope before recoil rippled through his shoulder. The effect of each shot felt magnified now, not because of individual impact, but because every fallen soldier disrupted the momentum of the advancing formation, forcing those behind to stumble, freeze, or recalibrate their approach under mounting psychological stress. The Japanese assault began to fan outward in an attempt to stretch the ridge's defensive line, but the narrow jungle terrain betrayed their efforts by funneling them back into choke points that the sniper exploited with ruthless precision. Each time a squad attempted to break left or right, the uneven ground forced them into bottlenecks where visibility deteriorated and coordination faltered, giving the sniper precious seconds to acquire clean shots before the attackers could regain their formation. Behind him, the squad felt the weight of the escalating confrontation, and their breathing grew heavier as they prepared for the possibility that the ridge might eventually be tested at close range despite the sniper's relentless firing. The machine gunner finally secured a partial line of fire and unleashed a controlled burst that stitched through the tree line, slowing one of the assaulting groups long enough for the sniper to identify and eliminate the squad leader whose commands had been driving the flanking maneuver. That single shot collapsed the formation into momentary confusion, revealing how critical leadership was to maintaining the assault's cohesion and proving the sniper's growing role as the decisive factor shaping the flow of the battle. Still, the attackers continued to press forward, driven by both discipline and desperation, as they pushed deeper into the kill zone, carved unintentionally by the ridge's terrain and deliberately by the sniper's precision. Heat radiated from the rifle barrel, warming the soup can until the metal shifted color and released a faint metallic scent that mixed with the heavy odor of damp earth and gunpowder swirling through the air. Yet, despite the mounting thermal distortion, the tunnel remained functional, channeling the light in a consistent pattern that preserved the clarity of the scope's sight picture, even as the battlefield became increasingly chaotic. The sniper sensed his muscles tightening under the continuous strain, but he forced his breathing into steady cycles, maintaining the rhythm that synchronized each shot with the narrow windows of enemy exposure created by their frantic movements. Bodies accumulated along the slope in scattered clusters, evidence of an assault that had grown increasingly reckless as the Japanese commanders attempted to overwhelm the ridge before their momentum was completely lost. The sniper, now fully immersed in the flow of battle, chambered round after round with a mechanical efficiency that fused instinct with precision, knowing that the coming minutes would determine whether the ridge held or collapsed under the weight of numbers. And, as he realigned the scope for his next shot, he sensed that the escalation had not yet reached its peak, because the forest still echoed with the determined footfalls of soldiers convinced they could break the defenders by sheer force of will. The Japanese assault, once driven by strict coordination and unwavering momentum, began to fracture under the cumulative pressure of the sniper's relentless precision, with each fallen soldier creating hesitation that rippled backward through the ranks like a tremor weakening the spine of a once solid formation. Through the soup can tunnel, he watched their advance shift from confident strides to fragmented movements marked by uncertainty, as squads that had previously surged uphill in tight patterns now faltered whenever another sharp crack echoed from the ridge. The once orderly climb devolved into a series of stuttering pushes, each one collapsing sooner than the last, as the sniper picked off key runners who attempted to rally their comrades through, shouted commands, drowned beneath gunfire and the forest's swelling noise. The slope, choked with bodies and scattered equipment, became a physical obstacle that forced surviving attackers to navigate a treacherous path cluttered with fallen branches, discarded rifles, and the unmoving silhouettes of men who had advanced moments earlier with full confidence. Every time the Japanese soldiers slowed to maneuver around the chaos, the sniper seized the interval to deliver another precise shot that struck before they could regain footing or restore formation. His rifle, heated and streaked with carbon, continued to respond with unwavering consistency, while the soup can tunnel maintained its stabilizing effect despite the barrel's rising temperature and the metallic scent drifting from the expanding seams. Behind him, the American squad sensed the subtle turning point long before the attackers did, recognizing that the tempo of the fight had shifted decisively as the jungle began echoing less with determined footfalls and more with conflicting shouts of confusion from below. The machine gunner adjusted his position carefully, testing short bursts that forced scattered Japanese soldiers to drop and crawl, further disrupting their ability to regroup or coordinate a unified second charge. The sergeant, crouched low beside a cluster of roots, finally allowed himself a tense breath as he realized the ridge no longer felt like a vulnerable outpost on the brink of collapse, but rather a fortified line held together by the astonishing accuracy of one improvised weapon. Still, the sniper refused to let the flicker of optimism distract him, maintaining a strict firing rhythm that balanced patience with urgency as he shifted his aim from one faltering squad to another. He targeted officers first, recognizing their influence on cohesion, and each successful hit created a visible ripple of disarray that widened through the ranks like cracks spreading across fractured glass. Some enemy soldiers attempted a desperate push across the open trail, hoping speed might counter precision, yet their sprint only made them clearer silhouettes against the backdrop of green foliage, granting the sniper easier opportunities to neutralize them before they closed the distance. The pressure exerted on the Japanese formation became undeniable as their movements grew increasingly reactive, shaped not by strategy, but by instinctive attempts to survive the invisible threat, dominating the ridge from an angle they had never anticipated. Every hesitation became a weakness, every pause an opening, and the sniper exploited each one with mechanical consistency, turning what had begun as a chaotic defense into a methodical dismantling of an assault force that once threatened to overwhelm his squad entirely. Even the jungle seemed to acknowledge the shift as the frantic noise that had filled the air for so long gradually softened, replaced by scattered shouts and the heavy breathing of soldiers who no longer believed the ridge could be taken by force. By the time the next wave attempted to assemble near the lower bend of the trail, the sniper had already disrupted their leaders, fractured their communication, and carved so many losses into their line that the formation dissolved before the push could even begin. The assault had not ended with a dramatic retreat or a final charge. Instead, it eroded steadily under the weight of precise, unbroken fire until the ridge, once seconds away from collapse, stood firm as the undeniable high ground advantage reclaimed by a single man's improvised brilliance. When the last echoes of gunfire finally drifted into the deeper reaches of the jungle, an uneasy quiet settled over the ridge, carrying the strange weight of a battlefield that had not yet accepted its own sudden stillness. The American squad remained frozen in their positions for several long seconds, each man listening for any sign that the Japanese assault might regroup, yet the forest yielded no organized movement, only the distant groan of wind slipping through leaves and the fading rustle of branches disturbed during the failed advance. Gradually, the soldiers lifted their heads from the mud, their eyes shifting toward the sniper with a mixture of disbelief, exhaustion, and dawning comprehension as the magnitude of what he had just accomplished began to crystallize. The sergeant moved first, crawling across the ridge with cautious precision, as though afraid that any abrupt motion might somehow break the spell that had protected them throughout the brutal engagement. His breath trembled with each exhale while he approached the sniper's position, stopping beside him only after confirming that the slopes below were truly clear of advancing enemies. For a moment he simply stared at the rifle, or rather at the odd metal cylinder strapped to the barrel, its once bright surface now darkened by heat, mud, and powder, appearing more like a relic of desperation than the strange innovation that had rewritten the outcome of the battle. He reached forward slowly and tapped the rim of the soup can with one finger, producing a faint metallic ring that seemed impossibly gentle compared to the violence it had helped unleash moments earlier. "I'll be damned," he finally murmured, his voice equal parts awe and apology, as though acknowledging that all his earlier skepticism had been misplaced from the very beginning. Several soldiers edged closer, their faces still streaked with sweat and dirt, and one of them let out a shaky laugh that carried not mockery, but relief, a recognition that the device they had once ridiculed had become the difference between living through the morning and being overrun before reinforcements could arrive. The sniper rolled onto his side, muscles stiff from hours of tension, and offered a quiet nod that conveyed neither pride nor triumph, only the weary acceptance of someone who had acted out of necessity rather than genius. He met the sergeant's gaze briefly, then looked back down the slope, where dozens of motionless shapes marked the path of the defeated assault, each one a testament to the precision made possible by a tool no textbook had ever endorsed. The squad followed his line of sight, and the reality of the ridge's survival settled upon them with growing weight as they realized just how close they had come to collapse before the improvised tunnel shifted the balance. One of the riflemen stepped beside him and crouched low, inspecting the soup can with a mixture of curiosity and respect, marveling at the simplicity of its design and the remarkable impact it had produced in a matter of minutes. He shook his head slowly, whispering that he would never again laugh at anything improvised by a man who understood the battlefield better than the manuals written far from its dangers. Another soldier, still gripping his weapon with trembling hands, muttered that headquarters would never believe such a ridiculous-looking device had stopped an entire assault, yet even he spoke the words with reverence rather than doubt. The sergeant placed a firm hand on the sniper's shoulder, grounding him in the present as he spoke with a conviction shaped by the near disaster they had all narrowly survived. "That stupid can," he said softly, "just saved every one of us on this ridge." The words carried no exaggeration, no dramatic flourish, only the honest recognition of a truth carved into the hillside by the bodies of the attackers who had underestimated the strange extension jutting from the sniper's barrel. And as the squad prepared to reset their positions for whatever might come next, they did so with a newfound understanding. Innovation born from necessity had accomplished what discipline alone could not, and the ridge owed its survival to the ingenuity of one man who refused to accept the limits imposed by conventional doctrine. Long after the battle subsided and the ridge fell quiet beneath the weight of stillness, the story of the sniper's improvised soup can tunnel began spreading through the unit with the slow, steady certainty of a truth that refused to be ignored, traveling from foxhole to tent as soldiers tried to make sense of how something so crude had achieved what regulation equipment had failed to accomplish. In the days that followed, men from neighboring companies visited the ridge to inspect the device for themselves, kneeling beside the sniper's rifle with a mixture of disbelief and fascination as they traced their fingers along the warped metal cylinder that had endured both heat and recoil without losing its essential function. Some laughed softly at the absurdity of it, yet even their laughter carried a strange respect, acknowledging that innovation in war often emerged from moments when logic yielded to necessity. Word eventually reached the battalion commander, who arrived with a small entourage of officers, expecting to find an embellished tale born from battlefield adrenaline rather than a practical tool worth studying. Yet, when he lifted the rifle and peered through the tunnel, Observing how the cylinder framed the sight picture with surprising stability, his expression shifted from skepticism to thoughtful calculation, as though he recognized that unconventional solutions might hold value in environments where standard equipment faltered. He asked the sniper to explain the device's origin, listening carefully as the young soldier described the glare, the humidity, and the distortions that had forced him to improvise a solution with the only materials available. The commander said little in response, but the quiet nod he offered carried an unspoken acknowledgement that ingenuity deserved recognition despite its unorthodox form. Within a week, several squads began experimenting with their own versions of the tunnel, shaping ration cans, spent shell casings, and pieces of cut bamboo into makeshift light channels designed to counter the jungle's unpredictable illumination. Some attempts failed quickly, while others provided